Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate your joining us. Our Cultivating Success webinar topic today is Fundamentals of Produce Safety, and this is the first of a two-part webinar series. Cultivating Success is a partnership of University of Idaho Extension, the nonprofit organization Rural Roots, and Washington State University Food Systems Program. Today's presenter is Stephanie Smith. Stephanie is a consumer food safety specialist with Washington State University, and she is located in Pullman, Washington, though giving the presentation today from her home. I'm Colette D. Phelps. I'm with University of Idaho Extension, and I will be your moderator today. Just a couple of quick webinar tips. We're all sharing a lot of bandwidth right now, so if you're having any trouble with sound where it gets scratchy, it's elongated, you can type into the chat to find out whether or not that is on your side or is a problem with Stephanie's sound. You can also close all of the other programs that are running on your computer. That's going to dedicate your bandwidth to the webinar. At any time, you can switch to the phone for your audio. A call-in number was provided in your welcome email. During the presentation, please type questions into the Q&A box for Stephanie, and we will take pauses throughout the presentation to answer those questions. The handouts will be available after this webinar on the Cultivating Success website, and you'll be able to download those to your computer so you don't have to take specific notes on each slide. I will show you at the end of the webinar where you'll be able to find those handouts. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and ask Stephanie to share hers to start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Colette. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to be discussing the fundamentals of produce safety and talking about the produce safety rule. And this is, as Colette said, this is the first part in a two-part series.
And I don't see yours. Let's see. I'm just double checking. Never mind, I see it now. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Just double
Thank
checking.
you.
Okay.
And as we mentioned, we'll talk about some of the needs for improved food safety in the fresh produce market and why there's such a focus on fresh produce. We will give an overview of the produce safety rule and talk about exemptions and some of the requirements that you'll need to comply with regardless of your exemption status. And then from there, I'll start talking about specific topics within the rule and best practices. So we will talk about soil amendments, worker health and hygiene, and wildlife and domestic animals. The information I'm going to cover in this webinar today, although I'll discuss the FSMA produce safety rule, overall the goal is to be able to provide safe produce, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. I do want to give a disclaimer. This is not an official produce safety rule training. That training is offered through the Produce Safety Alliance Growers Training. And if after this webinar you decide you would like to take the official training, you can use the link provided here to access information and about the training and also where courses are being offered. The goal of this webinar is to just provide an overview of coverage and exclusions of the produce safety rule, dive into some of the topic requirements, and then provide you with steps for getting started with providing safe produce, ensuring best practices, and then working towards being able to comply with the produce safety rule as your business grows. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. And the first topic is the need for improved food safety. It's estimated that each year that 48 million Americans, which is 1 in 6 Americans, are stricken ill from foodborne illnesses. And the cost of this is very expensive. The estimate is that it costs $55.5 billion each year just for medical treatment, lost productivity, and illness-related mortality. This does not include the cost for businesses, so it's expected that when you combine those costs in with this, that the number is much more significant. The reason why there's been such a focus on fresh produce is that it is responsible for 23% of outbreaks. And from 2006 to 2014, 16 of the 68 multi-state foodborne illness outbreaks were associated with vegetables. Bacterial contamination is the leading cause of most of these outbreaks, illnesses, and deaths. And with the produce safety rule that was implemented, which we'll talk about on the next slide, the goal is to be more proactive about preventing produce from becoming contaminated in the first place. So whether you're covered by the rule or not, again, the goal is to prevent produce from becoming contaminated. So again, with plant-associated outbreaks in the United States, most of the outbreaks are caused by vegetable row crops, such as leafy greens is a big one, and then also fruit, followed by seeded vegetables, and then also sprouts is a big one, and grains and beans. So this provides a breakdown of those percentages per type of product. This list gives an example of some of the fresh produce linked outbreaks. So there's been a lot of recalls of romaine lettuce and multi-state outbreaks from romaine lettuce, especially in 2018 and 2019, along with E. coli outbreaks from leafy greens in 2017. We have seen a lot of outbreaks caused by salmonella contamination of cucumbers, and also seen that with cantaloupes and mangoes. So at the end of the day, consumption of fresh produce is a major cause of foodborne illness. And then also, it's still a major cause of E. coli 0157H7 infections. There was a report that came out recently from the CDC that was discussing how E. coli is still a major player in causing contamination of fresh produce. One of the misconceptions about foodborne illness is that it's a temporary stomach flu. You get sick for a couple days, you might have vomiting and diarrhea, and then it self-resolves. And most of the time it's true, but not always. It can cause severe kidney injury from E. coli does. It can create hemolytic uremic syndrome, which basically can destroy the kidneys. It can result in chronic arthritis, neurological dysfunction, so brain and nerve damage. A lot of people that have had a foodborne illness end up with lifelong gastrointestinal illnesses. A lot of times other bacteria will end up overgrowing during the illness, and then it becomes a major problem where every time somebody has to take an antibiotic, that this one bacterium in particular will start growing and create really severe gastrointestinal illnesses. And then of course, foodborne illness can also result in death. On top of that, when you have pathogen contamination of produce, it can result in really heavy losses, as I discussed in the beginning slides. So some of these losses include, of course, loss of health or life for the consumer. It can reduce consumer confidence in the product as a whole. So even if your product's not involved in a recall or a multi-state outbreak, it can still cause loss of confidence in that market. We've seen that a lot with recalls of romaine lettuce, where it basically destroys the entire growing season for all regions that are growing romaine. There can be a loss of money from initiating recalls. Recalls are extremely expensive and can result in the business being completely destroyed. And then of course there's loss of revenue from the reduced sales. Food has to be destroyed. And then, as I mentioned, it can ultimately result in the complete loss of the business. So given that, we're going to move on now to giving an overview of the produce safety rule. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011, and it's composed of 7 different rules. So these rules are focused on preventing food safety hazards across the entire food system. And the one that we're going to focus on today is the produce safety rule. But there's a lot of other rules that include preventive controls for both human and animal food, and even sanitary transport of human and animal food. So by enacting these laws, hopefully there would be a reduction in foodborne illnesses and improved food safety in our food supply. So some more things about the rule. This is the first mandatory federal standard, especially covering produce safety, and it does cover the growing, packing, harvesting, and holding of produce. One thing that a lot of people don't understand is this rule does allow for inspections by regulatory agencies, and they have started conducting inspections already. There's also requirements for documentation that must be kept, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. There are different compliance dates for the produce safety rule based on the size of the business. So large businesses with sales over 500,000 had to start complying with the rule in January of 2018, whereas very small businesses with sales between 25,000 and 250,000 had to come into compliance with the rule in 2020. In part 2 of our webinar series, we'll start discussing, we will discuss the water related compliance dates. There have been some changes with that. So please do join us for part 2 where we'll discuss that in more detail. There are some exemptions for the rule. So one of the exemptions is for produce that's rarely consumed raw. This is an exhaustive list, and it doesn't include grains or any of the other items that are listed on below. So there is a lot of discussion about this list, that there's things that should be on it, or maybe there's things that are on it that should be taken off. But this is the list. There are also some other industries that have been working to get an exemption because they consider their product as being rarely consumed raw. Also, produce that's used for personal or on-farm consumption is exempted, as well as produce that is not considered a raw agricultural commodity. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So actually, we'll talk about it right now. So produce that's not considered a raw agricultural commodity would include produce that receives commercial processing. So for an example, if you were growing apples that were then going to a food processor to be made into applesauce or apple juice, then that produce would be exempted from this rule. The process that it does go on, that the produce goes on has to adequately reduce pathogens in the product. And there has to be documentation that, first of all, states that this produce is meant for further processing, where there's going to be adequate pathogen destruction. And then you also need to have annual written assurances from your customers that they are processing the product in a way that's going to destroy pathogens. Additional exemptions include farms with average sales less than $25,000. So this is the value of the produce over the previous 3-year period, and it is adjusted for inflation. So currently that amount is listed as $28,075. There's also qualified exemptions. And so these are for farms who have food sales averaging less than 500,000 per year as adjusted for inflation during the previous 3 years, and have direct sales to qualified end users that exceeds all sales to all buyers combined during the previous 3 years. So for example, if you're selling 51% of your food sales to a restaurant that's located not more than 275 miles away, then you would be eligible for a qualified exemption. Even if you are exempt from the rule, you need to prominently and conspicuously display the name of the business, the complete business address, and either put it on a label or at the point of purchase. So this is part of the rule that you have to comply with regardless. Additional requirements that you have to meet is to keep documentation of your exemption status, so things like receipts and invoices. You need to perform an annual review and verify your exemption eligibility, and then of course review, sign, and date your records showing that you're exempt, because it is possible that a regulatory agency may approach you to do an inspection, and you'll need to have this information available to show that you are indeed exempt. Additionally, an exemption may be revoked if you are involved in an active investigation of a foodborne illness outbreak, or if the FDA deems it necessary to prevent public health or to mitigate an outbreak. So if they come and determine that your farm is involved in an outbreak, they can revoke your exemption status. So because of that, you really want to be proactive about food safety. And with that, we'll segue over into talking about some of these specific topics and how you can be proactive about food safety on your farm. Our first topic that we're going to discuss is soil amendments. So as you're aware, soil amendments can be chemical, biological, or physical materials. And of course, you add them to support and improve plant growth. There's really a great concern with biological soil amendments because they're more likely to contain pathogens that can cause foodborne illnesses. So some examples of these include manure or any other biological components of animal origin. So things like bone meal or blood meal, those would all be considered biological soil amendments. There's specific definitions for treated soil amendments. So these are amendments that have been processed to completion to reduce the organisms of concern. And there is microbiological criteria for this to ensure that they've been processed to completion. And if you want more information on that, you can let us know, and we would be happy to provide you more details on that. Processing has to be done using a scientifically valid controlled process. So there's different types of processing, like using heat, using chemicals, or other biological processes. You can also use a combination of processes, but they need to be validated and proven to show that they're effective and that they work. And as I mentioned, the microbiological criteria include standards for different pathogens, including Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, and E. coli. So basically, the point is that the amendments should be treated to make sure that it results in destruction of these organisms so it doesn't contaminate the crops. Amendments are considered untreated if they have not been processed to completion. And in the case of agricultural teas, if you're using biological soil amendments that are unprocessed, if the water's from an untreated surface water source, such as a irrigation canal or irrigation pond, or if the water has any detectable E. coli per 100 milliliter sample of water, then it is considered untreated. The rule does discuss some composting options. And again, if you're going to be using composting for microbial destruction, it must be scientifically valid. So the rule has two specific composting options, which are aerated static composting and turned composting. And during both of these composting methods, you would need to take temperatures regularly and record that information to show that you have reached the minimal temperature for the required number of days. And then again, you can use other scientifically controlled processes as long as they're valid, scientifically valid. So if you're doing composting, on the farm, you need to be keeping records for the length of time that composting has been occurring, the temperature that was reached, and you would want to take multiple temperature readings, the number of times you've turned it, depending on which method you're using, and any other processing steps. So you'll need to keep records of these. If you're getting compost from a third party, then you want to have documents showing the name and address of the supplier where you're getting your compost from, the type of compost you're using and the lot number, the date and the amount purchased, and then again, documentation of the composting procedure that was done from the supplier and verification that it's meeting the requirements for being treated. So some application considerations that you want to take into account is that you want to avoid using manure for fresh produce. So the reason why is manure has a really high risk of for containing pathogens that can cause foodborne illness. And you don't want to be side dressing manure. So that's where you're applying it from the side to the roots, because it can contaminate the edible portion of the crop. You definitely want to maximize the time between when you're applying the soil amendments and then harvesting the crop. So the wider this time frame is between these two steps, the less likely it is that your produce is going to become contaminated. So it's really important to consider that. So for untreated soil amendments, the FDA is still pursuing research to determine what this maximum time should be. And there is a possibility that there might be changes to the produce safety rule after this research data has been collected and compiled. Raw manure absolutely cannot be applied to the harvestable portion of the crop, and it is exceptionally risky if it is. So that cannot be done. If the soil amendment is treated, they have what's called a 0-day application interval. So basically, if it's treated amendment, you could apply it and harvest it on the same day. But you need to remember that you need to use a scientifically validated treatment process. For application records that should be kept, you want to list the type and source of soil amendment that's been used, the rate and date that you applied it, and then of course any handling and sanitation practices should be listed as well. So some examples of that might be, you know, what types of tools did you use? Were those clean and sanitized? What are the standard operating procedures that you're using for applying them, and when are these soil amendments going to be applied? So these are all records that are good to have and that you should keep. With regard to handling and storage of soil amendments, it's a good idea to have designated tools and equipment. This is going to reduce the risk for cross-contamination where you're using a tool, for example, to apply, let's say, manure, and then using those same tools for harvesting or planting. So it's best if you can designate tools specifically for the soil amendments. With regard to cleaning and sanitizing equipment, you want to do this regularly. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's good to develop protocols on how tools will be cleaned and sanitized and how often. So for example, maybe you would use them and then clean and sanitize them and store them in a dedicated location away from other tools that would be used for planting or harvesting. You definitely want to reduce foot traffic and the risk for cross-contamination. So for example, you don't want to have a lot of foot traffic going past, say, a manure or a compost pile and then going out into the field, because this is more likely to bring potential pathogens from the soil amendment into the field at a time when you don't intend for that to occur. Also, runoff and wind drift is a really big consideration. So we always tell people that you really want to pay attention to where your soil amendments are being stored and that you should keep them covered. So you don't want runoff going into your water source that you're using for irrigating the produce. And you also don't want it to be blown over into your produce every time you get a large amount of wind. So that can create increased risk for the produce. So you want to make sure that you keep the soil amendments covered and put it in a location where it's going to reduce the risk of this occurring. You also want to keep raw and finished compost in separate areas to reduce cross-contamination between the two types of compost, and to make sure that they aren't mixed up. Animals can a lot of times go into compost areas and, you know, depending on what's being composted, and they can then drag this into growing areas on their hoofs or paws. So you want to make sure that animals are kept away. And when you are applying soil amendments, you want to consider if there's any risk to adjacent crops. So for example, you might have one crop where you're applying a soil amendment to it because it has a longer growing season, but in the meantime, you might have something that's ready to harvest very soon that's located adjacent to where you're applying the amendment. So it's really important to pay attention to that and to make sure that you don't inadvertently contaminate produce that's potentially ready to be harvested. So some of the steps you can take now is to preferably use only treated amendments and make sure that those amendments that you're using have undergone a scientifically valid process. You can implement handling and storage procedures to make sure that you're reducing the risk of cross-contamination and potential runoff into your agricultural water supply or wind blowing onto your produce. And then again, you want to be able to keep records, as we've talked about. So those are records that you can begin keeping now and taking steps to make sure that those records are in place. So with that, I was going to move on to worker health and hygiene. Are there any questions?
There aren't any questions yet. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type those into the Q&A box at any time.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to worker health and hygiene. So workers can carry human pathogens and then transmit it to produce. Salmonella typhi is a big one that's carried by humans, and if somebody's carrying that and then handling produce, they can contaminate it. Norovirus is another major one, and so is hepatitis A. There have been recalls, especially of frozen berries for both of those. So those are all pathogens that we've seen transmitted from humans onto produce. There are several ways that workers can contaminate produce. So again, any worker that's handling produce, if they're carriers of a particular pathogen, they can then contaminate the produce. This is especially true if they're also having symptoms of diarrhea or vomiting. That can increase the likelihood that the produce could become contaminated. We've talked about movement from manure or compost or even farm animals into growing areas. So I have a picture here of someone's boots, and I think that's something that can easily be overlooked, where somebody maybe is working in one area and then goes out into the growing area. And in the meantime, they inadvertently can track in animal feces, which could be contaminated with pathogens that can contaminate the produce. Eating, drinking, or smoking in growing areas results in, of course, having that continuous hand to mouth contact. And then if people are not washing their hands properly, then any germs that that person might have on their hands could then end up coming in contact with the plant. And again, hand washing is a really important factor there. So if people aren't washing their hands properly after doing things like using the toilet or eating, drinking, or smoking, then that can be a risk. Also, contamination of tools and equipment can be a really big problem. So we discussed that a little bit with the soil amendments, especially, but any tool or equipment could potentially become contaminated. So whether it's been in contact with animal areas, been used for other activities, that can all potentially result in contamination of the produce. And then also workers not changing their gloves, boots, or clothing regularly. So under the rule, gloves are not required to be worn, but they have to be kept clean and changed when they become soiled or contaminated. And regardless if a worker wears gloves or not, it's still not a replacement for hand washing. So they still need to be washing their hands after they use the restroom or after they eat. Feces, of course, can contaminate produce directly. And in some regions, there might be difficulty, if there's difficulty accessing a restroom and defecation occurs in the field, of course, that would be really high risk for produce contamination. And then, of course, worker injuries. So whether they're actively have an active injury that just occurred and they're bleeding, or if they have, say, an infected sore on their hand, that can all contaminate produce as well. So the produce safety requirement has specific, or produce safety rule has specific requirements for toilets and hand washing. So they do stick with the standard, the OSHA standard for toileting and hand washing facilities. And this is 1 per every 20 workers within a quarter mile of where the workers are doing their work. So one of the things to consider, though, is if a quarter mile is really, you might meet the OSHA requirement, but is that really conducive to anybody that's doing work out into the field? And is it going to encourage them to use the facilities if they have to walk a quarter mile? So that's something to keep in consideration, is that even though you might be meeting the standard, that it would be better to have those facilities available closer to where the work is occurring. The facilities have to be designated, located, and maintained to be accessible for servicing, and they have to be serviced and cleaned at proper frequency. So basically, there should be monitoring occurring to ensure that there's things like running water available. For instance, in this picture, this shows a very simple hand washing station with a 5-gallon jug that's filled with water. So somebody should be monitoring it to make sure that the jug's filled, that there's soap available, that the catchment for the water is not overflowing, or that there's paper towels available. So with hand washing, the rule specifically states that hands need to be washed thoroughly, that they need to be scrubbed with soap, and that running water needs to be available. So as I showed in the previous picture, even something like a 5-gallon jug with a spigot would constitute running water. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a complicated system. Also, you have to use single service towels, hand dryers, or other adequate methods. So you cannot use a reserve or a towel that is used by multiple people at this, one after the other. So if you are using an actual towel instead of paper towel, then they do need to be single service towels. And then you would need to keep a bin available for the dirty towels to go into, where they can be collected and then washed and dried properly before being reused. Workers absolutely must wash their hands before starting work, before putting on gloves, after using the toilet, returning from breaks or other absences, of course, after touching animals or waste, or any time hands have become contaminated. So these are specific rules. And then also, hand sanitizer is absolutely not a replacement for proper hand washing. So it's okay to have hand sanitizer available as a secondary method to sanitize one's hands after they have already been washed properly. With regard to worker illnesses, the rule states that workers must take measures to prevent contamination of produce. Ill workers, especially those that are potentially a risk to produce, must be excluded. So for example, if somebody is showing symptoms of having diarrhea, or they're vomiting, or they're jaundice, they have to be excluded from having contact with the produce. And then personnel must be made aware that they are to notify their supervisor if they're ill. So that's specific to the rule. Additionally, the produce safety rule has very specific training requirements. So all personnel have to be trained in the principles of food, hygiene, and safety. They need to know the importance of health and hygiene, and this also includes visitors. So if you have visitors that are coming onto the farm, they need to know that they can't visit if they have certain symptoms such as vomiting, diarrhea, jaundice. And then also they need to be made aware of places like what are the rules on the farm, what are areas they can go visit, and where the hand washing and toilet facilities are. And then, of course, anybody working must be trained on their job responsibilities per FDA standards. So there's specific standards in the rule. And again, we won't talk about those in detail, but if you have questions or need more information, please let us know. For documentation of training, so there's specific requirements, and training has to be documented. So that documentation includes the name of the trainee, the date the training occurred, and the topic that was covered. Additionally, the training must be done by somebody that is qualified to deliver that training. The training has to be done upon hiring. So before any work can begin, the training needs to be conducted, and that record needs to be created showing that the training was done. And then it has to be done additionally at least once per year. It also needs to be repeated if you see that standards are not being met and that workers are not following the regulations and rules on your farm. At that point, you would have to repeat the training. The rule also states that the training must be easily understood by the trainee. So for example, if you have a lot of Spanish speaking workers, then you cannot deliver that training in English, that it would need to be delivered in Spanish. If you have a lot of workers that do not have good reading skills, then you cannot provide them written training if they're unable to read the training that you've created. You need to have a designated person to ensure that there's compliance with the rule requirements. So again, this is where monitoring comes into play. So first of all, you want to make sure that the documentation's in place, that all the pieces of that documentation have been done, that people have been trained once a year or more if needed. And then also making sure that any workers on your farm are meeting are complying with the rules. Again, both workers and supervisors must be qualified through education, training, or experience. So again, these are very specific rules with regard to the produce safety rule. So some of the steps you can take now is to obtain additional food safety training and identify risk on your farm, and identify where you need to really put a lot of effort into addressing worker health and hygiene to reduce risk of potentially contaminating the produce. You can train your workers in food safety and start keeping that document in training records and keep them in a safe place. And then also making sure that you're following up on them, making sure that everyone's been trained at least once per year. And again, with identifying risk, really putting procedures in place to reduce contamination risk from occurring is going to be important. The toileting and hand washing facilities are critical, whether you're covered under the rule or not. So it's a good idea to have monitoring in place and to ensure that they're being kept well stocked and clean. So these are really going to be essential for keeping your produce safe, regardless of whether you're exempt from the rule or not. We did deliver a webinar specifically on worker health and hygiene. So if you want more information on this area, please do go to the Cultivating Success website, and you can find the recorded webinar at this web address. So please do visit that for more information. And also feel free to reach out to Colette or me if you need additional information. So our final topic we're going to discuss is wildlife and domestic animals. And I will pause for a moment to see if there's any questions.
No questions yet.
Okay, great. So hopefully that means that this is coming through okay and not that you're lost. So hopefully I haven't lost you, because it can be daunting and confusing as well. So, but please feel free to ask questions. Okay, so with wildlife and domestic animals, so this includes both wildlife, farm animals, and pets. And oh, I'm gonna stop for one moment. So it's asking about standard bacteria in soil. So before I start this section, I'll answer this question that was put into the Q&A. So there isn't a standard for bacteria in soil. So soil, contains all sorts of different microorganisms. And we'll talk a little bit in this next section about some of the potential risk with soil, or not with soil, but with contamination from animals. But no, there's no specific standard for bacteria in soil. Okay, so I will go ahead and get started and we can talk about that. So again, in this section, we're going to talk about both wildlife and then also farm animals and pets. So of course, animals can carry a lot of different human pathogens. They can enter into growing areas, especially wildlife, that are hard to control. And then they can, not only can they defecate in the growing area, but if they can also track it throughout the growing area. And then one thing to consider is that the animals can be resident or transient. So sometimes you'll see, there's always a number of Canadian geese in the field, or it might be like elk where you have a herd that comes through in the spring. So given that, there's going to have to be different, ways you have to pay attention to that and be able to control those things as best as you can. So the produce safety rule has requirements that you need to assess the growing areas for evidence of potential contamination during the growing season. So basically you need to go out into the field and determine if there has been any contamination that's occurred, if you're having animal activity, signs of chewing on plants or feces. And if there is significant evidence of potential contamination, you have to determine if the produce can be safely harvested. Additionally, you cannot harvest produce that is likely contaminated. So those are very specific rule requirements. So there are some ways that you can monitor and control wildlife. So some of the recommendations are to use deterrents. So for an example, using decoys, although a lot of times I think the animals grow wise to decoys, so you might need to mix it up a bit to make sure that they don't get used to the decoy. Fencing can be a deterrent, although depending on the size of your growing area, that can be difficult. Plus, we all know that deer can jump to amazing heights, but that is one potential deterrent. You can use things like visual deterrents. So sometimes they have those shiny reflective tapes that you can, that blow in the wind, and those can be deterrents for animals. And then of course, noise deterrents such as noise cannons, for example. So you really want to try to employ some of these deterrents if you're having a lot of problems with wildlife entering into your growing areas. As I mentioned in the previous slides, you really want to be monitoring for intrusion and signs of feces. So, looking to see if there's tracks in the area, if you're actually visually seeing feces, if produce has been trampled. If you do find animal feces, you want to make sure that you absolutely never harvest visibly contaminated produce that's going to the fresh produce market. And a lot of times, even if it's going on for food processing, a lot of times buyers won't want to harvest or won't want to accept visibly contaminated produce. So you just don't want to harvest it and take that risk, even if it's going for further processing. You also need to determine if other produce has become contaminated and whether it can be harvested. And sometimes this is basically going to come down to your subjective, it's subjective. So basically, if you go into an area, you see that a lot of produce has been trampled, you're seeing some feces on the ground, you might end up marking off quite a large area where you're not going to be harvesting any produce from that spot. So it could be, anywhere to a couple feet to, 20 feet or more, depending on what type of activity is occurring. But at the end of the day, the rule is that you can't harvest visibly contaminated produce. And so you need to keep that in mind when you do see activity or you are seeing feces in the field, and make sure that you are in compliance with the rule by not harvesting produce that's potentially contaminated. The other thing that the produce safety rule really points out is that it is expected that you co-manage both wildlife and your growing operations. So they don't expect you to go out and destroy habitat or to, kill all the wildlife in the area to prevent them from coming into the growing area. So the point is to take active steps to try to manage it properly to keep the produce safe, but also knowing that wildlife does exist and they're hard to control and that they will potentially come into the growing area. The other thing that's really important to point out too is you absolutely have to follow other laws. So you cannot just go, if you have an elk problem, you can't go out and just shoot the whole herd of elk. So they really want to point out that you need to make sure that you're in compliance with any other laws. With regard to documentation, being able to document any actions, including when you've monitored, if you've seen any risk, and what were those risks, where did you find, what type of risk was it, where was it located, and when. These can all really help you with trying to identify if you're starting to have increased problems. And if you're starting to have increased problems from this, then you can take more active measures to try to control this. You also want to document how any risk you observed were addressed. So, for example, you found feces in the field, you removed the feces, marked off the area, and didn't harvest the produce because the edible portion of the crop was present and there was concern that it could potentially be contaminated. So you marked off a 2-foot no harvest zone. Those are all things that should be documented and that you can begin documenting now. So farm animals and pets, a lot of growers might still be using pets in the field, or not pets, I'm sorry, farm working animals in the field is what I wanted to say. Excuse me, but you want to exclude farm animals and pets from the field, especially near harvest when the edible portion of the crop is present. With regard to pets, it's best to always exclude pets from the field, although it is noted that a lot of times pets might be used as a wildlife deterrent, right? But especially when the harvestable portion of the crop is present, you don't want to have an increased risk of having working animals in the growing area where they can potentially contaminate the produce. If you have an operation such as a U-Pick operation, or you have people that visit your farm, you should let them know that they should not be bringing their pets, and actually you should be excluding visitors' pets from your farm. You definitely want to keep your farm animals separated from the growing areas, and you want to make sure, coming back around to soil amendments is the same for farm animals. You want to prevent runoff and wind drift into the field. So if you have farm animals, their manure during the heavy rain, such as what we're having up here this week, depending on the slope of the land, that you could end up having runoff from the animal areas directly into the field, and that could contaminate your produce. And the same with the wind drift. So if you have an area where there's prevailing winds, you would want to have your animal operations basically downwind of your growing areas. You also want to develop procedures for handling feces, so making sure that you have dedicated tools, that the tools are being cleaned and sanitized, and again, that you're marking off contaminated produce, and to have procedures on what to do if you do find feces. Are you going to bury it? Are you going to remove it? And how is that going to be done? So workers can really help you with managing wildlife. So again, they should be trained with, number one rule, never harvest visibly contaminated produce. They can help you with keeping an eye out for any problems or for any animal activity. And they can help you handle the issue and report it to whoever's in charge of dealing with that. You also want to make sure that your workers are really well trained on proper hand washing, and that they know that they have to wash their hands after coming in contact with animals or feces before going back out into the growing areas. And again, just to re-emphasize with that they need to keep their clothes, footwear, and gloves free from contamination. And as a reminder, gloves are not required, but they're not a replacement for hand washing either. And so they should be trained on when things need to be changed, when their footwear, gloves need to be changed. They should know how to properly clean and sanitize footwear or gloves. And then it's also a really good idea to have dedicated footwear and gloves for different activities. So for example, if somebody's going to be working where you have farm animals, to have specific footwear and gloves for those that can then be changed out of, to put on different footwear and gloves for going into the growing areas. So some of the steps you can take now is to exclude working animals close to harvest, and also to just exclude all non-working domesticated animals, and making sure that they're being kept away from growing areas. You can begin your monitoring and documentation procedures. And definitely, if you're having a problem, work with putting up deterrents to try to help keep wildlife away from your growing areas. Develop your procedures, make sure your workers are trained. And again, you want to document the training of your workers. And the number one rule is to never harvest contaminated produce. So in summary of our webinar today, so there's a lot of steps that you can start taking now. And this is really going to reduce some risk to your farm and business, and some of the potential costs associated with those risks. It really ensures that you're delivering the best quality and safest produce to your customers. And there's a lot of buyers that are going to want you to be complying with the produce safety rule, even if you're exempted. And so this can have, being able to comply with this can really impact your business in a positive way by helping to grow your business and making your product accessible to more potential buyers. And at the end of the day, it can really help you with farm management. Even if you're exempt from the produce safety rule, it's important to become familiar with good agricultural practices, also known as GAPs. So a lot of the produce safety rule requirements overlap with GAPs. And so in many instances, if you're complying with one, you're complying with the other. And it also, don't be afraid to reach out for assistance. Even with regulators, their goal right now is to do a lot of education and not to penalize. They want you to be successful. They want you to, but they also want you to be putting out safe produce. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Here is a list of additional resources. So the Produce Safety Alliance offers the official growers training, and then FDA has information on the produce safety rule. WSU Extension has a specific website that's focused just on produce safety. So please do visit it and take a look around. And then also your state's Department of Agriculture is here to help. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, I'm just going to give it a second, Stephanie. Thanks for that presentation. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A box. We'll just give that a second. Okay, it kind of looks like maybe we are not having any other questions that are coming through. So thank you again for that overview, part 1 of Fundamentals of Produce Safety. Would you like to say anything about the topics that will be covered in next week's webinar, Stephanie?
Certainly. So next week, we will be discussing the agricultural water requirements. So I briefly showed you the requirement dates for those, but we'll be going into detail about the agricultural water requirements. That one's a little more complicated. And then we'll discuss post-harvest handling and sanitation. And then we'll talk about developing a farm food safety plan. So please do join us next week for part 2.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to show you where you can find the recording for this webinar. It's going to be on the Cultivating Success webinar page. I'm sorry, I'm making sure that I don't have a bunch of open windows. Here it is right here on recorded webinars. So that's where you're going to find this webinar recording as well as the webinar handout. As Stephanie said, next week we'll be doing part 2 of Fundamentals of Produce Safety. And then on Tuesday, June 2nd, we will be doing a webinar on taking eggs to market, safe egg handling and delivery. We do really appreciate your feedback. If you could please complete the post-webinar evaluation, that would be incredibly helpful to us. You can see the link here on your website. This link is going to generate automatically at the conclusion of the webinar. Our surveys take about 3 minutes to complete, so very, very simple. And again, your feedback is very important to us. If you miss this launching, you will receive a reminder email tomorrow, which again gives you the link to where you will find the webinar recording and the presentation handout. With that, again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Stephanie, for your presentation, and we look forward to having you on with us next week.